and I want to introduce Marian. Marian Frances White was born and raised in Carbonear, as I was, by the way. Her family was 12 kids, and mine was 8. We were slightly different eras, so we never crossed paths at that time. But her family would have known my family, and some of her crowd would have gone to school with my crowd. So, there's that. Anyway, Marian has spent her professional career as an author, a documentary maker, a researcher, a poet, an advocate for women's rights. And her most recent book, In Her Glory, which I highly, highly recommend, is a beautiful book. And it's stories of her childhood in Carbonear and lots of stories about her mother, her father too, but largely of her mother. And Marian was the creative force behind a documentary film made about 25 years ago on the women's suffrage movement in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I think she's going to share a little snippet of that with us today. So welcome, Marian. We're so glad to have you along. Okay.
How wonderful to, I'm just going to adjust your mic, my dear. We got to be able to hear you.
Thank you, Your Honors, for this wonderful opportunity. I am honored. And we are going to, first of all, see just 5 minutes of my docudrama about the untold story of the suffragists of Newfoundland, and get to see the early part of the movement. And then I will tell you a little bit about the other part, if that works for everyone here. Okay.
As we go marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, a thousand pillows gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses.
Situated in the North Atlantic, at the most eastern point in North America, lies the great island of Newfoundland. England's first colony in the New World, Newfoundland's vast cod fishery fed the British Empire and trained its navy from the 1500s. But settlement was discouraged in this rugged and bountiful place. Chimneys and women were forbidden. Both flourished. Life was unforgiving in the North Atlantic. Women did hard work alongside men to survive and to build the country. And by the 1850s, the country of Newfoundland was a self-governing dominion in the British Empire. But social conditions were often desperate. Rum was cheap and public drunkenness common. In the capital city of St. John's alone, there was a public liquor house for every 66 men, women, and children. Men and boys were often paid in alcohol in exchange for work. As a result, countless families were living in dire poverty. By the end of the century, conditions had not improved greatly. Epidemics were common. Child mortality was high. It was women who voluntarily did almost all the social work with the starving, the orphans, the widows, and they wanted change in the liquor laws. Women believed if they could vote, they would reform lax liquor laws and put an end to public drunkenness and wife and child abuse. In 1890, they established the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Newfoundland. Members of the WCTU, like young Maria Williams, were among the first women to speak before a mixed audience.
It is a well-known fact that women are the greatest sufferers by strong drink. And if there is any enjoyment in it, it is the men who have it, because they are enjoying the warmth and comfort of the gilded saloon. The poor woman is often found freezing over the fireless stove, or listening to the cries of her poor, hungry, cold, ragged children, and not knowing the moment she will receive the blow from the wretch she is forced to call husband.
In 1891, during a period of particular economic and social unrest in Newfoundland, members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union marched to the House of Assembly in St. John's, demanding the right to vote in local liquor laws. The fashionable Lady Jeanette Forward was their patron and led the march. With her was the fiercely outspoken Jessie Murray Owen and the future WCTU president, Emma Peters. These women were among the first feminist voices in Newfoundland. Jessie stated their case.
Women with years of toil in the field of reform have learned that a power we have not is needed to put in practical operation the principles we believe in. That power is the vote.
In her book, Where Once Our Mothers Stood, We Stand, historian Margot Dooley writes that few who marched that day in 1891 would live to see their dream of women's suffrage fulfilled. It would take 34 years for this outrageous notion to become politically acceptable.
Thank you. It really moves me every time I see that opening and see so many wonderful actresses and actors that took part in making this film. The next part of the film, of course, will go more into the dramatizing of the second wave of the women's suffrage movement. But I'll tell you a little bit about the backstory of making the film. As you can tell by now, the story is about the 35-year struggle by a group of women to win the right to vote. And this docudrama came about over almost a 10-year period. I didn't initially set up to make a film, but to rather find a way to include more women in the study of Newfoundland and Labrador history. The medium of film appeared to be the most concise and interesting way to accomplish this. However, little did I know all the obstacles that I would have to face in the fledgling film industry in this province, and to have to convince the financial powers in Canada that this was a story worth telling took several years. But going back to the 1990s, when I was compiling and publishing an annual agenda book called A Woman's Almanac, Voices from Atlantic Canada and originally from Newfoundland and Labrador, the almanac served as a means to acknowledge and celebrate many contributions women had made to our culture and our political past. As I continued to research information for this annual agenda book, I came across the names of several Newfoundland women who had accomplished a great deal in their lifetime. However, within the context and mandate of the almanac, which was largely to celebrate current women who were still alive so that they could enjoy the accolades, I always kept room for just one or two stories of women from our past. So I was limited there to how much I could reveal. Over time, the mounds of archival correspondence, newspaper articles, and a few photos of these women surfaced, and their movement to win the right to vote, it became so compelling to me that I put aside the annual almanac to focus on writing the film script, The Untold Story. I wanted to hear the voices of these early suffragists. And I wanted to recreate some of their moments through the talents of some of Newfoundland's wonderful and finest actors, from Ruth Lawrence and Janice Spence, who's no longer with us, to Greg Malone and Pete Soucy and Benny Malone. But the biggest question that inspired me in my research was why? Why had I not heard of Fanny McNeil? Why had I not heard of Vereen Gosling, May Kennedy Goodrich, Julia Salter Earle? They were not in the history books I learned at school, or in any writing that I could find on the province, until finally Margot Dooley wrote and published her fabulous book, Where Once Our Mother Stood, We Stand. My hat endlessly goes off to Margot, who's here today. Margot has a second book coming out, and I can't wait to read it, on the suffrage movement. And I also have to say that many of you, I hope all of you know, Margaret Dooley, her niece, and she has just published a fabulous book about the life of her niece, Margaret Dooley. So I thank you again for that as well. Back to this story. As I said, the more information I found about these women, the more I realized I was unearthing something of vital importance to our knowledge of who we are. The film's purpose is not only to document a movement to achieve a right that most of us today take for granted, but also to continue in the vein of celebrating women's achievements. Most of the women you encounter in the early part of the film, beginning around 1891, they did not live to see enfranchisement passed in the House of Assembly in 1925. It would be the task of their daughters and granddaughters to continue to struggle for equality. Indeed, some would argue that on many levels, the struggle for equality continues to this day. Writing the Untold Story was not as difficult as making the film, mostly to finance it. I did not want to have someone go back to me 5, 10 years, and here we are now 25 years later, and say, this could have been done in a better style, or you left this out. I really wanted it to live up to the expectations that those amazing women worked towards for that 35 years. Greg Malone, as the director, certainly helped me achieve that. But unlike a book that is very much a solo project until it involves publishers and later the reader, a film, no matter the genre, involves hundreds of people. And more specifically, several key people, including, as I mentioned, Greg and Paul Pope, who's no longer with us, and Janice Ripley, Sandy Morris, who was our musical director, and the narrator of the film, Sonia Smits. The Untold Story offers the viewer a tangible glimpse of a significant political movement. In every society and culture, there remains many untold stories, and now that the suffrage victory has been told, perhaps others will be inspired to unearth more stories of Newfoundland and Labrador's distinctive, long and varied past. So the Untold Story docudrama highlights an event that led to women winning the right to vote. The docudrama genre was ideal for this film because it made use of archival footage, the limited photos, and many published letters, as well as dramatizing key events. Through this combination of styles, the story reveals an incredible period in Newfoundland history: great social struggles, temperance, devastating fires, the Great War, the privileged, and the downtrodden. The text and most of the dialogue are taken from archival research and original documents. It is a story that reveals remarkable strength and determination of women and offers insight into Newfoundland's political and cultural past. Through the film, a rich and little-known part of Newfoundland's history unfolds. This is the story of a key group of women who took it upon themselves to see that women were given the same right to vote as men. It's a surprising tale of courageous women who fought a 35-year battle to win the right to vote. The film begins around 1890 and ends with their victory in 1925. While the focus of the docudrama is the story of women's struggle to get a succession of governments to take their demand for the right to vote seriously, it is also the story of men who supported their struggle and of those who stood in their way. There are many well-known events in Newfoundland history. Then there is the story, filled with facts and dates and backed up by speeches taken from the House of Assembly, records or Hansard files, newspaper clippings, personal letters, archival photos, and footage. Piece this together and a story emerges. A compelling story of how a group of women fought for the same thing they all believed in, and they eventually won. Newfoundland, as England's first colony, was greatly influenced culturally by its mother country, Great Britain. The large steamers that docked on the waterfront in St. John's brought trade and often took away passengers destined for London, England. It was not uncommon for women to accompany with their teenage daughters or sons who were going off to finish their education in London. Often they returned with new ideas and many opinions on politics and a new way of life that they saw there. Public suffrage meetings were on the rise on the streets of London. The famous Pankhurst sisters of London were fighting on their home front for their right to vote. News of their militant acts were in the news daily. Young women returned home to Newfoundland. They were now well educated, but eye-opened and ready to share their experiences that they had abroad with family and friends at home. This great need for the right to vote was largely influenced, as you were saying, by the lax liquor laws that were here at that time. Child mortality was high, and by voting to repel lax liquor laws, women would help put an end to deplorable working situations. It was women who voluntarily did almost all the social work with the starving, the poor, widows, and they wanted to say in how they were governed. Their first big task would be to convince government that they had the support of thousands of Newfoundlanders. But several events influenced the closing years of the 19th century and the struggle for enfranchisement. First of all, the outspoken leader of the early movement, Jessie Marian, left Newfoundland with her new husband, Nils Ullman, from Montreal. This marked the end of the first wave of the suffrage movement in Newfoundland. However, as Jessie's steamer sailed out to St. John's Narrows, another woman was making a name for herself in St. John's. That woman was Marian Gosling. I can hardly say her name without. She brought an incredible strength to this province. She came from Waterloo, Quebec, to take up the position of principal of the Church of England Girls' School in St. John's, and she later married the mayor of St. John's, Gilbert Gosling. Together they became a positive force in St. John's society. Marian and the woman she would soon meet, Fanny McNeil, would lead the second wave of the women's suffrage movement. I'm delighted that in a few short months, a monument will be unveiled to celebrate Marian Gosling, and I thank all the women and Jen Dion and Margot who have been spearheading this now for a number of years. The struggle for the vote was interrupted by the Great Fire of 1892 that virtually destroyed the city of St. John's. But women put aside their issues and under the leadership of Marian worked tirelessly over the next decade to raise funds to replace the devastated infrastructure. However, as you also pointed out, they had no say in how that money could be spent. This inequality would further motivate suffragists to demand the right to vote. The massive war of effort that happened gave them position and power. With the war finally over, women gradually got back to the issue of suffrage and organized themselves into the Women's Franchise League. By 1918, suffrage had been won in Great Britain and appeared imminent in the United States. By now, most provinces in Canada had gained suffrage except Quebec, which did not win suffrage until 1940. Women organized a major publicity blitz of St. John's and surrounding areas. The goal was to collect signatures on this petition all across Newfoundland. Suffragists sent a string of letters to all the newspapers, motivating delegations to work towards the united cause of women's suffrage. Finally, as we know, the Squires government fell and the new government under Walter S. Monroe, filled with suffrage supporters like Crosby and Cashin, quickly passed the Women's Franchise Bill in April 1925. The Newfoundland suffragists were immediately the toast of the International Alliance Convention held in Paris, France, and were eagerly celebrated around the world. At home, the Corner Brook Western Star neglected to even report on the passage of the bill. The Telegram duly reported that the Monroe government gave women suffrage. But as we know, no one gave suffrage to the women of Newfoundland. It was a hard-won victory, which the women celebrated at Smithville Hall in St. John's on April 21st, 1925. Now, I would like to finish. I realized this morning that in one of my early books of poetry, I wrote a poem called The Untold Story that encapsulates the whole movement. I'd like to read this, and I have dedicated this book to her honors, which I'd like to leave with you today. The Untold Story. We were a country, not a colony, when our mean gosling shouted, "We strive for freedom for ourselves and for all Newfoundland women." Then May Kennedy jumped from her seat and called out, "To the country of Newfoundland." That was before England called us to war, and before the streetcar frightened horses as they paced along Water Street, their carts full of daily passage. On the waterfront, settlers waved as steamers set sail for Halifax, London, Boston, New York. A winter chill did not daunt their resolve to find life abroad. Newfoundland was not a joke. It was a proud people. Whiteway, Bond, Squires, even a boy called Joey knew that. But so did Armeen, May, Julia, Annie Mitchell, and Fanny McNeil. The dailies full of people settling scores, young domestics coming from the bay to find their way up Prescott Street to the grinder homes along Rennie's Mill and Circular Road. Some never made it and sailed instead to Boston. But what is our history if it buries the past? If it does not tell of Maud Hutchings and Annie White debating the vote all the way up the brow? A mantra sounds over the waves. Come back from your maiden voyage, ancient women, shapeshifters, to claim our home, Newfoundland. Thank you.